The mist over the lake clung to the water like a veil of secrets, soft gray against the dawn. I stepped onto the dock with my coffee, breathing in that familiar scent of cedar and damp earth, the smell of home. At 68, these quiet mornings were what I lived for: the stillness, the rhythm of waves brushing the pilings, the echoes of memories built with my late wife Sarah. But that morning something was different. My stomach knew it before my eyes did. Something was waiting for me. There it was, bright orange, nailed, not taped, to the boathouse door. My chest tightened as I walked closer. The paper screamed at me in big block letters: final notice, unpaid HOA dues, demolition scheduled. I froze, the steam from my coffee curling into the cold air, my fingers clenching until the styrofoam cup nearly buckled. I wasn't part of any HOA. My land stood a half-mile outside their perfectly manicured kingdom. Yet here it was, an eviction threat masquerading as a bill. $11,740.26. Due immediately, and if I didn't pay, they claimed they'd tear my boathouse down in 3 days. I felt the nail's ugly bite as I yanked it free. A hole now scarred the wood Sarah and I had painted together 30 years ago. That tiny puncture in the siding hurt more than the bold numbers on the page. It was a violation. A stranger's hand had scarred our memory. I walked back inside, set the notice on the kitchen counter, and stared at the phone. Maybe it was a mistake, I told myself. Someone in some office had checked the wrong box. I dialed the number. She answered on the second ring, her voice sugary, rehearsed. Lakeside Pines HOA. This is Mara. How can I help you? I explained, polite but firm. I wasn't a member. My land wasn't theirs. The county plat map proved it. She made a little tutting sound, like a teacher correcting a child. Oh, Mr. Weller. Yes. I see your file right here. It looks like you're behind on dues. There are no dues, I said flatly. She sighed, a long fake patience sigh. Well, our records show your parcel was annexed 6 weeks ago following a community vote. I'm sure the paperwork was mailed. But don't worry, I'll flag it as a clerical mix-up. It'll all be corrected before any crew is dispatched. Her tone was honey, but her words were poison. Annexed. Community vote. The way she said it made my skin crawl, but what could I do? She promised to fix it. I hung up uneasy, but hopeful the next morning. Hope shattered under the growl of diesel engines. I heard it before I saw it, the grinding crunch of heavy tires on gravel. I looked out the front window, heart sinking. A flatbed truck idled at the end of my driveway, its exhaust clouding the air. On its back, a yellow backhoe, folded like some sleeping beast. A man in a reflective vest and hard hat stepped down, clipboard in hand, eyes avoiding mine. He was big, burly, his face set in lines carved by years of demolition. He walked to the porch. Can I help you? I asked, my voice even though my pulse pounded. He grunted. Tom Weller. I am. He nodded, tapping his clipboard. Ted Kruger Demolition. We got orders to clear the boathouse. If the site ain't cleared, we start on the main cabin. He jerked his thumb toward the backhoe. 12 grand or the walls come down. The words landed heavier than the machine itself. Yesterday's sweet-voiced secretary was a liar. This wasn't a mistake, it was an attack. I stared at Ted, realizing he was just a tool, like the backhoe behind him. Arguing with him was pointless. I gave a slow nod. All right, let me make a phone call. I stepped inside, locked the door, and grabbed my phone with trembling hands. There was only one person I trusted with this, my daughter Dana. She answered on the first ring. Dad, you okay? Her voice was crisp, steady. I explained everything. The notice, the call with Mara, the backhoe now breathing in my driveway. I tried to keep my voice calm, but the strain cracked through. There was silence, then her tone shifted. Not daughter, not casual. This was Special Agent Weller speaking. Dad, listen carefully. Don't go outside. Don't talk to them. Take pictures from every window. The truck, the plates, the man, everything. Then go to your file cabinet. Find the deed, the tax bill, the survey from when you built the boathouse. Photograph each page with a timestamp. Then drive to the county clerk's office. Get a certified copy of the plat map. Do it now. That's your shield. I swallowed. Yes, email me everything. I'll call back soon. I love you. The line went dead. My fear hardened into focus. I had a mission. Camera clicks filled the silence. The truck from the kitchen window, the foreman smoking from the upstairs. Bedroom plates zoomed in until the numbers shone clear. The old deed, the tax bills, the survey lines all captured, dated, time-stamped, proof. By the time I left for the county office, the truck was still there, engine rumbling like a threat. I ignored it, clutching the manila folder of documents to my chest like a lifeline. At the clerk's office, the smell of dusty paper wrapped around me. A young woman pulled up the plat map on her computer, spun the screen my way. The black line was thick, clear, and undeniable. My land lay far outside the HOA boundary. That's it, I said. My voice shook with relief. I need a certified copy. The heavy stamp hit the page like thunder. This was no longer just a piece of paper. It was evidence. Driving home, the map on the passenger seat felt like a shield. But before I reached my driveway, Dana's call came through. Dad, it's not a mistake. It's a target. Mara Jansen filed altered maps 6 weeks ago. She's done this before, 2 other counties, both times moving HOA lines to swallow property she wanted. This is deliberate. My grip on the wheel tightened. The sweet-voiced secretary wasn't incompetent. She was a predator. When I pulled into my driveway, the truck was gone. For a heartbeat, hope flared. Maybe the map scared them off. But then I saw him, a man in a collared shirt with the HOA logo, hiding by a tree, telephoto lens pointed at my window. He was taking pictures of my life like it was evidence against me. Then he slipped away. That night, 2 black sedans arrived. Dana stepped out. First, her eyes sharp, scanning everything. Behind her came Ray, my middle son, all quiet intensity, a Homeland Security agent who moved like shadow, and Mark, my youngest, quick-witted, a postal inspector with the grin of a man who smelled fraud, like others smelled smoke. The kitchen table where they once did homework became a war room. Dana spread the certified map beside Mara's forged one. Ray laid a ruler across the lines 200 feet shifted north, swallowing my cabin. Mark highlighted signatures from the community vote. 3 were dead, 1 had moved states. Years ago, forged ghosts had stolen my land. We sat in silence, the weight of betrayal pressing down. Then came the rattle of the mail slot, another envelope hand-delivered inside. A new bill. Fines doubled, $23,480.52. They'd fine me $10,000 for the paint color of my cabin, unchanged in 30 years. It was laughable, absurd but terrifying in its brazenness. Mark smirked, but his eyes burned cold. They're burying you in fake debt, Dad. Forcing a sale. That's extortion. Ray crossed his arms, voice gravel. They think paper is power. We'll show them what real power looks like. The next dawn, a crash rattled my house awake. Tires squealed away, leaving behind a massive rust-red dumpster dropped squarely across my driveway. Blocked in a cage, spray-painted words taunted me. Property of Lakeside Pines, HOA. I didn't panic. I documented. Notes app. 5:32 a.m. dumpster delivered. Blocking access photos. Timestamped proof. Mark dialed the HOA treasurer. Speakerphone on. Greg Purcell's voice oozed a smug satisfaction. Pay the fines or the inconvenience keeps piling up. Sell the place, it'll be cheaper for him in the long run. Mark's eyes flicked to mine. Got him extortion. Recorded in his own words. Dana typed furiously, drafting a Sasandicist letter, a masterpiece of precision. She handed it to the sheriff when he arrived, grim-faced. He marched it straight to Mara's manicured doorstep. Watching her sugary smile vanish as she read it was worth more than 23 grand. The dumpster was hauled away. A small victory. But that night, a neighbor called. Tom, check Facebook. There it was. A picture of my cabin, posted by the HOA, captioned non-compliant, public notice of violation. My name tagged for all to see. They had dragged me into the digital stocks, but the plan backfired. Neighbors called one after another. Bill fined for a garden gnome, Cheryl for a welcome mat, a young father for a tricycle. Mara's tyranny wasn't just mine, it was everyone's. Still, when the chainsaws roared 2 days later, I wasn't ready. I came home to splinters where my boathouse had stood, Sarah's cedar walls stolen, looted by Mara's nephew, and there, among the wreckage, I found a photo, Sarah and me, young and smiling, covered in sawdust, building that boathouse with pride. My knees buckled. For the first time, the fight drained out of me. Dana's hand touched my shoulder. Ray stood silent, jaw tight. Mark's grin was gone, replaced by cold fury. They didn't offer hollow comfort, they just stood with me in silence. The promise unspoken. This wasn't defense anymore, it was war. That night, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the jagged splinters of cedar that used to be my boathouse. The photograph of Sarah lay in front of me, edges frayed, smile eternal. My hands shook as I traced her face. They hadn't just destroyed a building, they'd stolen 30 years of memories. For the first time I felt hollow, beaten, but my kids weren't hollow. They were burning. Ray slammed his fist on the table hard enough to rattle the coffee mugs. That's it. No more defense. They made this personal. We go on offense. His voice was low, sharp, the kind that cut through despair like a blade. Mark leaned forward, eyes dark, no trace of his usual grin. They're not stopping, Dad. Not until you're gone, but here's their mistake. They left a trail. And trails lead to convictions. Dana placed a hand on my shoulder, grounding me. Her voice was calm, but steel hid underneath. Dad, they think you're a victim, but they don't know your family. They picked the wrong target. We're going to bait them. And we're going to trap them. I looked up at my not children anymore, agents, warriors, and I realized I wasn't alone. The plan unfolded like clockwork. Step 1, bait. The next morning I bought a dozen 2x4s and a sheet of plywood. Not enough to rebuild, but enough to look like I'd started. I stacked the lumber neatly on the dock, right where Sarah and I had built the boathouse decades ago. Then, in my garage, I spread out decoy plans. Detailed sketches of a new boathouse with notes like exceeds county code scrawled. In the margins, I placed them in plain sight, visible through the garage window. A lure, irresistible to a control-obsessed HOA president. Step 2. Surveillance. Ray works silently, moving like a shadow through the property. He had 4 more cameras the size of golf balls. One went inside a birdhouse, lens peeking out through the hole, perfectly aimed at the dock. Another he tucked under the garage eave, angled at the window with the decoy plants. A third nestled deep in the hedge along the property line. And the last sat on a shelf inside my cabin, aimed out the back window, capturing a wide-angle view of the yard. He synced the feeds to his phone, then to Dana's. "We'll see her before she even steps onto the dock," he murmured. The waiting was torture. Every alert made my heart jump. A squirrel darting across the dock, Bill's golden retriever sniffing the lumber, a UPS driver dropping off a package. Each ping raised our blood pressure, then fell flat. Hours stretched into days. Nothing. Maybe Mara had finally felt the heat, but arrogance never sleeps long. On the third morning at 11:30 sharp, Ray's phone buzzed. He held it up, and the live feed made my blood run cold. Mara Jansen. She parked her silver Lexus at the top of my driveway, well away from the cameras she thought she knew about, and strutted down like she owned the place, clipboard in one hand, phone in the other. She snapped photos of the stacked lumber, her lips pressed thin with disapproval. Then she walked straight onto my dock, heels clicking, as if trespassing were her God-given right. I watched from behind the curtains as she bent over the boards, inspecting them like contraband. Then her gaze shifted toward the garage. She marched up the gravel path, eyes narrowing at the window. She leaned in, squinting at the decoy plans. Phone raised to snap. "Pictures." Ray whispered. "Got her." And then came the sound that turned the air: electric tires on gravel. Not one vehicle. 2 black SUVs rolled silently down my driveway, engines humming low. They stopped with precision, blocking Mara's car in quiet crunch of tires on it. Rock made Mara spin around, her smug expression curdling into confusion. The SUV doors opened. 3 agents stepped out, dark suits sharp, movements efficient. They weren't HOA lackeys. They were federal. The second SUV door opened, and Dana stepped out, jeans jacket. Calm as a mountain in a storm. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. Authority radiated off her like heat. Mara's face flushed crimson. "What is the meaning of this? You're trespassing. This is HOA property." Her voice cracked, a little too high. Dana stopped a few feet from her. Her voice was cool, level. "Ma'am, while you are currently trespassing on my father's property, that's the least of your problems today." Behind her, another car pulled in. The county sheriff. He climbed out with a folder thick with warrants. His deputies followed, heading straight past us toward Mara's perfect lawn and HOA office. Mara's head snapped toward them, horror dawning as they walked through her gate. You can't do this." Dana pulled a leather wallet from her jacket, flipped it open. Credentials gleamed. "Mara Jansen," she said, voice firm, official. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The Miranda warning cut through the morning air like a hammer on glass. Mara's shoulders sagged. The sugary charm evaporated. All that remained was a hollow woman, staring as handcuffs closed around her wrists with a metallic click that echoed louder than thunder. For the first time in weeks, I exhaled. But this was just the beginning. The courtroom was a different kind of battlefield. The prosecution laid out the evidence piece by piece, each document a nail in Mara's coffin. The altered plat maps, filed in secret, with lines shifted just enough to steal my property. The so-called community vote, signatures forged from the dead and the long gone. The fraudulent fines delivered by hand to skirt mail fraud charges. Mark testified, walking the jury through the tricks: how the notices avoided postal systems, how the altered vote forms were mailed internally to avoid federal oversight. His voice was steady, professional, impossible to dismiss. Dana presented the recordings, Greg Purcell's smug admission that they'd make me want to sell. The jury flinched at the tone, the cruelty. Then she dropped the email Mara to Greg. "The old man on the lake called. Stall him, make him sell before he figures it out. Don't worry about the law. We are the law here." The courtroom fell, silent. Even Mara's lawyer looked pale. The judge, a stern woman with steel-gray hair, leaned forward. Her voice was sharp as a gavel. "Mrs. Jansen, this court finds you guilty of conspiracy, wire fraud, and extortion." Mara slumped in her chair. Greg Purcell flipped instantly, testifying against her in exchange for leniency. The jury deliberated less than an hour. The verdict was swift. The sentencing was poetry. Restitution for harassment and emotional distress, $64,000. Full reconstruction of the boathouse from Mara's personal assets. Dissolution of the Lakeside Pines HOA, its charter revoked. Administration handed to a court-appointed receiver. But the final blow came not in that courtroom, but in the county commissioner's chamber a month later. Spurred by the scandal, they voted unanimously. All HOAs in the county would be subject to mandatory independent audits every 2 years. Mara's greed had sparked reform far beyond my property lines. On a bright Saturday morning, a different truck pulled into my driveway. Not demolition, delivery. Cedar planks, fresh and fragrant, stacked neatly in the sun. My neighbors Bill, Cheryl, and even the young father with the tricycle arrived with tool belts and coffee we built together. Hammers ringing laughter. Carrying across the lake, it wasn't just lumber going up. It was community. Rebuilt nail by nail by sunset. The boathouse stood proud once more. I drove the last nail into the roof, sweat on my brow, and looked out across the still water. Mist hung low again, soft and quiet. Just how Sarah liked it. I held her photograph against the new cedar, her smile bright as ever, and I whispered the words that had carried me through the storm. You can't vote against gravity. Truth always prevails. The sound of those handcuffs closing around Mara's wrists should have been the end of the story. But real life doesn't wrap up that easily. Arrests are only the beginning. The real test came under the fluorescent lights of the courthouse, where every lie Mara had built was about to collapse in front of strangers, sworn to judge her fairly. The trial began 2 weeks later. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood polish and stale air, the kind of place where justice felt heavy and slow. But that morning the energy buzzed sharp alive because the community was watching. The gallery was packed. Neighbors who had once whispered in fear now filled the benches with arms crossed and jaws tight. Bill sat in the second row, Cheryl beside him, both glaring at Mara like she was a storm cloud that had finally broken. Mara entered flanked by lawyers, her posture stiff, chin high, as if she still believed she held power. But the cuffs had taken something from her. Her eyes darted, restless, searching for allies and finding none. The prosecutor wasted no time. Piece by piece, he stacked evidence like bricks in a wall too high for Mara to climb. The forged plat map was projected on a screen for the jury to see. The black boundary line so subtly nudged north, swallowing my cabin hole. Then the certified map from the county, stamped and sealed, undeniable in its clarity. Side by side, the contrast was devastating. Mara's lawyer tried to object, claiming clerical inconsistencies. The judge cut him off with a single word: overruled. Then came the vote sheet. The page that had once chilled me when Mark laid it on our kitchen table. The prosecutor's voice sharpened as he pointed to each highlighted signature. Frank Miller deceased, 2018. Joan Peterson deceased, 2020. Carl Beasley moved to Florida a decade ago. He paused, letting each revelation settle over the jury like a fresh nail in Mara's coffin. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Mark took the stand next. My youngest son, the postal inspector with the restless grin, now deadly serious, he explained, in crisp, professional terms, how Mara's crew delivered fines by hand to sidestep federal mail fraud statutes. His words were precise, his tone impossible to dismiss. When he described the conversation with Treasurer Greg Purcell, his smile returned, cold and cutting. He told us they would make my father sell. That's not enforcement. That's extortion. The jury scribbled furiously. Mara shifted in her seat, her composure cracking under the weight of her own greed. Then came Dana, my daughter, my protector. She stood tall on the witness stand, her presence steady, unflinching. She presented the photos I'd taken, time-stamped images of trucks, plates, men smoking cigarettes while my property trembled under their threats. She laid down the certified plat map like a sword, then read aloud Mara's own email. The old man on the lake called. Stall him. Make him sell before he figures it out. Don't worry about the law. We are the law here. The courtroom fell into a silence so deep I could hear the hum of the overhead lights. Mara's lawyer buried his face in his notes. The jury looked at her as if she had already sentenced herself. When the defense finally called Mara to testify, it was almost painful to watch. She tried to summon her sugary charm, speaking sweetly, dismissing everything as misunderstandings, but the cracks showed. Every time the prosecutor asked a direct question, she stumbled. When confronted with her brother's company receiving hundreds of thousands in phantom general contracting fees, she shifted in her seat, sweat darkening her collar. Those were legitimate disbursements, she insisted. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. To your brother, with no invoices. The jury's faces hardened. Greg Purcell sealed her fate. He took the stand with the plea deal already in his pocket. He admitted everything: the dumpsters, the backhoe threats, the hand-delivered fines. She told us to scare him, he said plainly, his eyes cast down. She said he'd fold, like the others. The gallery erupted in whispers. Fold, like the others. It wasn't just me. She'd done this before. The judge restored order with a gavel, her eyes sharp as glass. Continue. The prosecution did, methodically, relentlessly. Wire fraud, conspiracy, extortion, each charge nailed down by evidence so clear even Mara stopped pretending. The verdict came back in under 2 hours, guilty on all counts. When the judge read the restitution order, I almost couldn't believe it. $64,000 for harassment and distress. The full reconstruction of my boathouse, paid from Mara's personal assets, and the dissolution of the Lakeside Pines HOA, its charter revoked, its board disbanded, its empire gone. But the punishment didn't stop there. The judge's voice rang out, sharp as steel. This case reveals systemic abuse of power within homeowners associations. Let this serve as notice: fraud will not be tolerated under the guise of community governance. The courtroom erupted in applause, unplanned, unstoppable. The judge banged her gavel again, but even she smiled faintly, letting the sound wash over Mara like a tide she couldn't fight. Outside, the air felt lighter. Neighbors gathered around me, clapping my back, shaking my hand. Bill leaned in close, his voice hoarse with relief. "She's done, Tom. She'll never hurt anyone again." But change didn't stop at the courthouse steps. 2 weeks later, the county commissioners convened in a crowded chamber. For once, the HOA leaders weren't at the microphone demanding more power. They were sitting silently in the back, pale, nervous. The commissioners voted unanimously. All HOAs in the county would be subject to mandatory independent audits every 2 years. Transparency wasn't optional anymore. Mara's downfall had sparked reform that would ripple across every neighborhood. For me, the sweetest moment came on a bright Saturday morning when a different kind of truck rolled into my driveway. Not demolition, delivery. The lumber was fragrant, cedar, the same kind Sarah and I had chosen decades ago, a gift paid for by Mara's seized assets. My neighbors arrived one by one, tool belts strapped, coffee in hand. Bill carried a hammer that had seen 3 generations. Cheryl brought sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Even the young father whose son's tricycle had sparked a fine showed up, determination shining in his eyes. We built together. Every nail driven was an act of defiance against Mara's tyranny. Every plank of cedar raised was a step toward healing. The sound of hammers rang out across the lake, not as destruction, but as renewal. I stood on the dock, Sarah's photo tucked into my shirt pocket, and watched as walls rose again where splinters had once cut into the earth. The boathouse was reborn, not from one man's hands, but from a community reclaiming its dignity. By evening, the roof was up, golden in the fading sunlight. I drove the final nail into place and stepped back. Mist drifted low across the water. Just like the morning when it all began, I pulled the photo from my pocket, Sarah's smile beaming back at me, and whispered to the lake, to the trees, to the world: you can't vote against gravity. Truth always prevails. But as the last echoes of hammer strikes faded into the night, I realized something else. This wasn't just about me. It wasn't just about my land. It was about every person who'd ever been bullied by people who thought rules gave them the right to steal. And that meant the fight wasn't really over. Because bullies like Mara would always exist. But so would people like us. People who refused to fold. People who knew that justice, like gravity, always pulls liars back to earth. The smell of fresh cedar filled the air, sharp and sweet, carrying memories with every breath. For the first time in weeks, the sound of engines in my driveway wasn't a threat but a promise. Trucks unloaded lumber, shingles, nails, and paint. Cans, all bought from Mara's seized assets. It was justice you could touch, justice you could build with your hands. Neighbors trickled in, each carrying something. Bill showed up first, his hammer swinging from his belt, the same tool his father had used to build their family barn. "Figured I'd put it to good use again," he said, his grin wide but eyes shining. Then Cheryl arrived, arms full of sandwiches, wrapped neatly in wax paper, her voice trembling as she said, "I couldn't sleep until I did something to help. You've carried this fight for all of us, Tom. It's our turn." One by one, more came. The young father with the tricycle violation wheeled in a cart of power tools, his son perched proudly on his shoulders. A retired carpenter who'd been fined for the color of his shutters carried a toolbox older than me. A widowed schoolteacher brought her teenage grandchildren to lift planks and paint beams. Each arrival was another nail in the coffin of Mara's reign, another act of defiance against tyranny disguised as bylaws. The work began at dawn. Hammers clanged, saws whirred, voices called across the lot, but this wasn't chaos, it was harmony. Every swing of a hammer was purposeful, every lift of lumber done with determination. My kitchen table, once a command center, now groaned under platters of food and thermoses of coffee neighbors had brought to fuel the crew. I stood by the dock, Sarah's photo warm in my shirt pocket, watching as walls rose from ashes. My hands itched to help, but my children insisted I rest, to let them and the neighbors do the heavy lifting. Still, I couldn't stay away. I grabbed a hammer, drove nails beside Bill, sweat stinging my brow, and for the first time in months, I smiled without forcing it. Ray moved like a general, his tactical instincts guiding the project with military precision. He measured twice, cut once, and barked instructions that everyone followed without question. Mark, restless as ever, darted from task to task, double-checking measurements, securing beams, and cracking jokes that made the teenagers laugh even as their arms ached. And Dana, my daughter, my anchor, kept us all steady, moving from crew to crew, her calm voice turning chaos into order. By midday, the frame stood tall against the blue sky. Neighbors stopped to wipe sweat, leaning on hammers and laughing like Kids, the first time in a long while, we weren't just surviving, we were rebuilding. But it wasn't just wood going up that day. Stories poured out, unspooled like threads weaving us together. Bill admitted he'd been fined $500 for his garden gnome, a cheerful little statue his late wife had painted. He'd paid it quietly, too ashamed to fight. I thought I was the only one, he said, voice cracking as he swung another nail home. Turns out, we were all being robbed. Cheryl confessed that the HOA had threatened her with foreclosure for her mailbox being 2 inches taller than regulation. She'd nearly sold her house out of fear. Tears streaked her face as she handed me a sandwich. You gave me back my courage, Tom. We'll never be silent again. The young father told us how Mara's board had demanded he repaint his house 3 different times in 2 years, each time claiming non-compliant tones. He'd nearly bankrupted himself trying to satisfy their impossible rules. This, he said, motioning to the rising boathouse, is what real community looks like. Not rules, not fines. This. Their voices stitched together a truth bigger than my fight. Mara hadn't just targeted me, she'd terrorized everyone, feeding off fear, using paperwork and bylaws as weapons. And now, with every story shared, the spell broke. Her reign of intimidation was dead, buried under the weight of solidarity. By late afternoon, the boathouse stood proud again, a skeleton of cedar ribs waiting for its roof. The sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the lake. I climbed the ladder, hammer in hand, and drove the last nail into the peak of the frame. The echo rang across the water. Not just a sound, but a declaration. We had won. As I climbed down, the crowd erupted in cheers. Some clapped, some whistled, some simply cried. I felt their hands clap my shoulders, steady and firm. I felt Sarah's photo press against my heart. For a moment, I closed my eyes and imagined her there, standing on the dock with me, smiling, at the sight of neighbors lifting each other instead of tearing each other down. That night, we gathered on the dock. Lanterns glowed softly, casting warm light over tired faces. The air smelled of cedar, sweat, and roasted chicken someone had brought for dinner. We sat in a circle, eating, laughing, remembering. But as the laughter faded, silence settled, and all eyes turned to me. I stood slowly leaning on the railing, the lake calm behind me. My voice was rough but steady. They thought they could scare us. They thought they could take what was ours. But they forgot one thing. You can't vote against gravity. You can't forge truth. You can't bully community. We stood together and we won. And we'll keep winning, every time they try to rise again. The crowd erupted, cheers carrying across the dark water, echoing back like the lake itself was cheering to. As lanterns flickered and neighbors drifted home, Dana lingered beside me, her eyes soft. You know, Dad, she said, this wasn't just about you. This set a precedent. HOA boards across the county are shaking right now. Ray smirked, crossing his arms. Good, let them shake. Mark tossed a cedar chip into the fire pit, sparks rising into the night. Because next time they try this, they'll think twice. And if they don't, we'll be ready. I looked at my children, proud and strong, and felt Sarah's presence in the quiet night air. She had built this home with me, plank by plank, and now our children had rebuilt it, law by law, truth by truth. The mist rolled back across the lake as the night deepened, just like it had the morning this nightmare began. Only now, it wasn't a shroud. It was a blanket, soft and protective, tucking us in. And I realized the fight hadn't just rebuilt a boathouse, it had rebuilt a family, a community, a faith in justice itself. The sun rose slow and golden the morning the last boards went up. The boathouse stood complete, its cedar siding glowing fresh, smelling sharp and clean like the very idea of new beginnings. The dock stretched proud into the lake once more. And for the first time since Sarah's photo slipped from the wreckage, I felt whole again. Neighbors gathered one final time, this time not with hammers, but with folding chairs, picnic baskets, and laughter. Kids skipped stones across the water, their giggles rising like music. For weeks, the air had been filled with the clang of nails and the hum of saws. Now it was filled with peace. But justice didn't just live on my dock, it rippled outward. On the courthouse steps, reporters swarmed as the judge's orders spread. Headlines screamed across the county. HOA president convicted of fraud, ordered to rebuild victims' property. For every homeowner who had ever been threatened with foreclosure over mailbox paint or fined for flower beds, Mara's downfall became more than news. It was vindication. Inside her cell, Mara sat alone, stripped of her tailored blazers and sugary charm. Word spread quickly among inmates about the HOA queen who'd once lorded over lawns and paint swatches. Now she was just another prisoner, trading her clipboard for a mop, her fake smile for silence. For the first time in years, she had no one left to bully. But the real legacy wasn't her punishment. It was what came next. The county commissioner's new law, mandatory audits every 2 years, spread like wildfire. Other counties adopted it, then neighboring states. HOA boards that had ruled unchecked for decades suddenly faced scrutiny they couldn't dodge. Balance sheets once hidden behind locked doors were dragged into daylight, and with every audit, more fraud surfaced. Mara hadn't been the only one. She'd just been the first to fall. One evening, weeks after the reconstruction, Cheryl stopped by with a newspaper folded under her arm. She laid it on my table with a smile that looked 10 years younger. "Tom, look at this," she said, pointing to the headline. "State launches task force to investigate HOA abuses." I read the words slowly, my chest tightening with something that felt like pride. What began with a single orange notice nailed to my boathouse had grown into a movement that would protect thousands. Sarah would have loved that. She always believed the small fights mattered most because they set the tone for bigger ones. But even as reform spread, the human stories mattered more to me. Bill restored his garden gnome to his front yard, its chipped paint bright against the green. He threw a barbecue the next weekend and invited the whole neighborhood, the little statue standing guard by the grill like a sentinel of freedom. Cheryl planted flowers around her too-tall mailbox, daring anyone to tell her otherwise. The young father repainted his house, the color his wife had loved before Mara's fines drained their joy, and his son rode his tricycle in circles on the driveway. Free at last. The lake community, once tense and divided, now felt alive again. People waved more, lingered on porches, swapped stories without fear. The HOA that once ruled with iron fists was gone, dissolved into nothing but memory. In its place, a community bloomed, messy and imperfect, but real. One Saturday morning, as mist curled low over the water, I walked out onto the rebuilt dock. The cedar planks creaked beneath my slippers, familiar yet new. I carried my coffee in one hand and Sarah's photo in the other. I stood at the edge, watching the lake shimmer, and felt her beside me. "You'd laugh at all this, wouldn't you, Sarah?" I whispered. "Me, an old electrician, taking on an HOA and starting reforms across the county. You'd say I should have stuck to wiring light fixtures." I smiled through tears. "But you'd also remind me that we built this place with our own two hands. And nobody, no bully, no forged map, no crooked president could ever take that away." Behind me, footsteps crunched on gravel. Dana walked up, her jacket unzipped, hair catching the morning light. She leaned on the railing beside me, her eyes soft. "Dad, you realize what you did here, don't you?" "I just wanted my home back," I said quietly. She shook her head. "You gave people their voices back. That matters more than you know." Ray joined us, carrying a thermos, his eyes sweeping the horizon like he couldn't turn off the instinct. "Bullies like Mara don't disappear, but now people know how to fight back." Mark ambled up, last coffee cup in hand, his grin restored. "And hey, Dad, next time some HOA treasurer tries to extort someone, guess who they'll call?" He winked. "The Weller family hotline." We laughed together, the sound carrying across the water as the sun rose higher. Neighbors began to gather again, this time just to enjoy the view. Kids dangled their feet off the dock, couples strolled along the shore, and the rebuilt boathouse stood like a monument to what happens when truth refuses to bend. I lifted my coffee cup, a silent toast to Sarah, to my children, to the neighbors, who found courage and unity. "You can't vote against gravity," I said softly. The words rolled across the lake like a prayer. "And you can't bury truth, it always rises." The mist began to burn away, revealing the water in its full, glittering glory. Life had tried to drown us in lies, but the current of justice had carried us back to shore. And as long as I had breath, I knew one thing for certain: this was our home, our lake, our community. And no HOA president, no bully in a blazer, would ever steal it again.